Greetings from the Freedom Wellbeing Institute. My name is Susan Stevenson and I'd like to welcome you to Understanding Wellbeing Terminology. I will be discussing how new knowledge is developed, the terms well-being, mental health, universal well-being, and there'll also be included a note for professional wellbeing practitioners. First of all, how is new knowledge developed? This is really important as we begin to discuss these terms related to well-being. Normally, researchers begin by developing a belief about something that is happening in their world. For example, a researcher might believe that the world is in fact square. So that might be their belief. It has no evidence, it's just a belief that they hold. So philosophy and beliefs are the same thing. The next step they would take would be to develop an explanation of why they have the belief or philosophy they do. And this development of an explanation is called the creation of theory. So a theory tries to explain something that we believe in a formal way. For example, a person who believes that the world is square, their theory might explain that belief by saying people get in ships, they sail out to sea, and they don't come back. The explanation the researcher might have for that is that they've sailed out to sea and they've simply come to the edge of the earth and they've not come back because they've simply fallen off the end. So that could be the theory they create about their belief. Once they've developed a philosophy or belief and a theory that is an explanation, they start to define the particular terms that they are using in their philosophy and theory. And this is quite important. This is about getting really clear about what are we talking about so that we can actually begin to research our philosophy, theory and definitions. And it's in the research that we begin to test whether the philosophy, theory and definitions stand up or not. So all sorts of research projects and investigations could be constructed with a view to testing the philosophy, theory and definitions that have been constructed. Now the research investigations conducted might support the philosophy, theory and definitions. They might support part of them or they might support none of them. So the researcher will need to be ready to make adaptations depending on what comes back when they conduct research on their philosophy, theory and definitions. If the research is supportive of the philosophy, theory and definitions that the researchers developed, usually researchers then begin to share or what we call disseminate the things they've found out to professionals or people in the fields that would find this valuable or interesting. And so when those research results go to those people and people use those in practical ways, then that is what we call practice. And so this is where a professional or someone in a field is actually using a philosophy, theory, definitions and some information found in research to actually help them to do their job, and in a setting which is not controlled like an experimental research. It's out there uncontrolled, and this is probably the toughest test for philosophies, theories, definitions to actually withstand. Now in the term discussions that we're going to have, I'm going to refer back to this explanation so that you can get a better idea of what you're dealing with and when these terms could be relevant or useful for you and when maybe they're not so useful. The first term discussed was well-being. Now, well-being is based on what we call the medical model of the world. So the medical model of the world sees a cause and effect in things that happen to us. So if someone goes to their doctor, they're experiencing headaches, the doctor may give them pain medication to address the pain. or they might actually decide to conduct tests to find out a little bit more about what is actually causing those headaches. So the term well-being, while there are definitions of this in psychology and medicine that are quite testable, the one that most people refer and use is that by the World Health Organization. And the World Health Organization said, well-being is part of a broader definition of health, which states that health is a state of complete physical, mental and social well-being and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. Now, this particular definition, I think, is quite complex and multifaceted and could be very difficult actually to test. Usually we look for definitions to be much more precise and clear in order for us to be able to test them. So the word well-being is based in the fields or the disciplines of psychology and or medicine, and the people who use this operate according to professional standards and ethics, so they're usually people like doctors and psychologists. So this term well-being is normally using information from those two fields, psychology and or medicine. Now the purpose of this term well-being used in this way is to support clinical people to actually diagnose serious conditions, for example anxiety, depression and psychosis. It relates generally to a low percentage of the population. So usually somewhere between 0 and 25% of people will be diagnosed with a well-being condition that meets the definitions used by medical doctors and psychologists. The term mental health really has arisen a little bit as a contrast to physical health, but it's based on what we call this biopsychosocial model, and so mental health really refers to what happens to people as a result of biological, social and environmental and psychological factors. And so when these come together and the outcome is negative, it usually relates to what we call poor mental health. The World Health Organization has a very complex definition of mental health. It says that mental health is a state of mental well-being that enables people to cope with the stresses of life, realize their abilities, learn well and work well, and contribute to their community. It is an integral component of health and well-being that underpins our individual and collective abilities to make decisions, build relationships, and shape the world we live in. Mental health is more than the absence of mental disorders. It exists on a complex continuum which is experienced differently from one person to the next, with varying degrees of difficulty and distress, and potentially very different social and clinical outcomes. Mental health conditions include mental disorders and psychosocial disabilities, as well as other mental states associated with significant distress, impairment in function, or risk of self-harm. People with mental health conditions are more likely to experience lower levels of mental well-being, but this is not always or necessarily the case. Now, this particular definition would be very difficult to test because it actually covers a lot of different topics and concepts, all of which would need broken down to really test what this actually means. So the term mental health is still based in psychology or medicine, so one of those two fields, and it still refers to people who are diagnosed with well-being conditions. As mentioned before, things like anxiety, depression, psychosis. So these conditions are at such a serious level that they can be recognised by, for example, doctors and psychologists. And again, mental health actually relates to a low percentage of the population. So somewhere between 0 and 25% of people are likely to experience a mental health diagnosis in their lifetime, and normally at the lower end of that percentage. The next term we're going to look at is universal well-being, and this is a diagram of the universal well-being model that underpins the term universal well-being. And you can see there's 4 components to this. The sensory inputs in the centre, there's 6 dimensions around the sensory inputs, and then out on the sides where you can see there are determinants of universal well-being, and then you can see there are 5 principles across the top that overarch this model. Now, universal well-being is designed to be tested, and its definition says universal well-being is a holistic and multidimensional concept of our overall well-being state that is impacted by sensory inputs derived from diverse social interactions. It is comprised of social, physical, intellectual, cultural, ethnic, emotional, and spiritual dimensions at a macro level, and 70 determinants shown by research to influence human functioning at a micro level. It achieves a coherence through 5 overarching principles. Now, this definition has been constructed to be able to be tested in research. So the universal well-being terminology is based on research from multiple fields. The people who use universal well-being also work according to professional standards and ethics. They could, for example, be universal well-being or professional field practitioners. So the kind of research that has underpinned this definition of universal well-being comes from psychology, medicine, teaching, education, counselling, nursing, social work, Indigenous studies, sociology, occupational therapy, and even physics. So this is what we call a multidisciplinary research base. And the universal well-being term and model is designed to support holistic universal well-being and optimal human functioning. So this is something that could relate, as it says, to all people. So universal well-being is something that all people experience to a greater or lesser extent. And because of the different determinants of universal well-being, people can identify areas of strength and talent, areas where there might be no impact, where there could be harms, and where there are definitely harms. Finally, well-being is a term that is supported by a diverse number of models. So there are many, many models of this well-being term. Many are not evidence-based, and that's just something people might need to consider if they decide to employ these. The term well-being, there are nearly 1,000 definitions, non-evidence-based, of well-being. And also in our research we've located just under 300 actual models. Now all of these well-being definitions and models that we've located have different foci, sources, purposes, and they can't be compared scientifically. Often they are not embedded, do not have a philosophy or a theory base. Often there's been little or no research conducted on them, and we're also often unclear how they work in practice. So well-being as a term does not have a base in any particular academic field. In fact, sometimes you'll see a definition of well-being that's not actually based in academia at all. It may or may not have a professional structure or ethics around it. Rarely is this term actually based in research. Its purposes can be unclear or diverse, and in some cases the term could be used to, for example, promote money making. For example, you'll often see vitamins or products described as helping your well-being, but it may not be clear how, and it may not be clear if they've ever been tested. and it's often used as a marketing term to appeal to everybody. And one of the things we would caution around this term, just well-being, without that kind of philosophy, theory, definitions, research and practice base, is that these can actually be dangerous, or the products and activities they may be promoting may in fact not be safe. So the focus of the term well-being is often unclear and often difficult for people to decide. It is very difficult to support and develop people's well-being if we're not actually clear what we're talking about, and if we're not clear what the term well-being means, it will be impossible to create a measurement and actually see if we are actually making a difference to well-being. I've provided here a summary of the well-being terms being discussed, and so you can see on the left you can work out if the term is based in research, what field or fields it's based in, what the general purpose of the terminology is, who it relates to, and also whether the definition could be tested by research or not. Finally, a note for professional wellbeing practitioners, that is any of you out there who are supporting the wellbeing of other people, I'd like to encourage you to join a professional organisation. This is a great way to stay current. Usually professional organisations are gathering and receiving information and updates on well-being or universal well-being or mental health, and so this can be a great place to get that evidence or research based information that is moved through that structured research process that I talked about at the beginning. Another thing that's very important is to make sure that the way you practice or work, practice is really another name for the work we do, it's important to practice in a way that's professional, legal and covered by ethical standards, and going to this trouble really shows that you care for the people that you're working with. I'd also encourage you to check the origins of all the materials you use. Sometimes they've been developed through a robust process, and sometimes we just go onto the internet and we find something and we assume. Sometimes we assume because it comes from a particular organisation that it's been researched and is has a good background, but that may not be the case. So I'd encourage you to dig just a little bit deeper. I also finally encourage you to use research, or what we call evidence-based material, whenever possible. The nice thing about using this is it gives you the security of knowing that the material you're working from has actually been tested, and you can often go to that research and find out a little bit more, or talk to the people who created or who have published on it and learn more about the material or the practice or the resources that they might be providing or recommending to you.